A millionaire used to controlling everything except his own desire. She, a 17-year-old virgin who never imagined she'd be part of such a dangerous game. 9 months later, the past came back to collect. If this story got your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The sea crashed against the rocks of Emerald Island with a violence that perfectly mirrored the temperament of its owner. Alexander Blackwood observed the movement of the party through the bulletproof windows of his private office, a glass of 20-year-old Scotch whiskey resting between his fingers. At 38, he had learned that every gesture, every look, every word carried the weight of an empire built on foundations that few dared to question. The celebration of his birthday was taking place in the mansion's external gardens, where golden lights mingled with the moonlight, creating an atmosphere of decadent luxury. Influential politicians conversed in select groups, businessmen closed deals disguised as toasts, and international models circulated like living pieces of art, all competing for a glance, a word, any crumb of attention from the most powerful and feared man in the country. Alexander knew his presence was awaited downstairs, but something kept him in that refuge of glass and mahogany. Perhaps it was the weariness that had been growing inside him in recent months, a kind of emptiness that not all the power in the world could fill. He had built that empire with his own hands, transforming the pain of a childhood marked by rejection into fuel for insatiable ambition. The illegitimate son of a magnate who never publicly acknowledged him, Alexander had learned early that feelings were luxuries he couldn't afford. His mother had died when he was only 16, taking with her the only moments of tenderness he had known. Since then, Alexander had turned his heart to stone and his soul to steel. Each conquest, each property acquired, each rival destroyed was a way to prove to the world that he needed nothing and no one. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. He expected it to be Marcus, his assistant, but when the door opened, it was Sarah Miller who appeared, carrying a crystal tray with appetizers to replenish in the main hall. Alexander had known her for years. She worked on his island whenever he hosted larger events, a middle-aged woman, honest and hard-working, who had raised her daughter alone after being abandoned by her boyfriend during pregnancy. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Blackwood," said Sarah with the respectful voice that everyone used when addressing him. "I just came to replenish the canapes on the main table." Alexander nodded, returning his gaze to the window, but something made him turn again. Behind Sarah, almost hidden in the shadows of the corridor, was a young woman he had never seen before. Wavy brown hair fell over delicate shoulders, and even in simple clothes, a white blouse and a basic black skirt, there was in her a presence that immediately captured his attention. "Who is she?" asked Alexander, his voice carrying an authority that didn't admit evasions. Sarah followed his gaze and, for a moment, showed nervousness. "That's my daughter, Emma. She came to help me tonight. I need the extra money to pay for her college application." Emma Miller. The name echoed in Alexander's mind like a melody he couldn't forget. She raised her eyes and, when their gazes met, something inside him collapsed and rebuilt itself at the same time. There was in her eyes a mixture of innocence and strength that completely disarmed him. It wasn't the calculated beauty of the women who attended his events, wasn't the studied charm of those who tried to win him over. It was something natural, authentic, devastatingly real. Emma quickly looked away as if aware that she shouldn't be there, that she didn't belong to that world of excess and power. But Alexander couldn't stop staring at her. She had turned 17. A few months ago, Sarah had mentioned this in previous conversations, and yet there was a maturity in her that contrasted with the youth of her face. "You may go, Sarah," said Alexander, without taking his eyes off Emma, "and take your daughter with you." But even after both disappeared down the corridor, Alexander remained standing before the window, his heart beating in a way he hadn't felt in years. He tried to ignore the feeling, attribute it to alcohol or fatigue, but he knew he was lying. To himself. There was something about that girl that had profoundly affected him, something that had awakened a hunger he didn't even know he possessed. He went down to the party determined to forget the encounter, but his eyes unconsciously searched for Emma. He greeted investors, talked business, smiled for photographs, but part of his mind was occupied with the image of those brown eyes that had looked at him for just a few seconds. It was when he saw her again, now serving drinks in the pool area, that Alexander knew he couldn't simply ignore what he was feeling. Emma moved with a natural grace among the guests, always maintaining a respectful distance, almost invisible in her role as a temporary employee. But to Alexander, she was the only real person in that sea of artificiality. When Emma headed to the kitchen to fetch more supplies, Alexander followed her. He knew he was crossing a dangerous line, but something stronger than reason propelled him. He found her alone in the corridor, leading to the service area, and when she turned and saw him, the fear and surprise in her eyes hit him like a punch. "Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, trying to maintain the professional composure her mother had certainly taught her. "Alexander," he corrected, his voice huskier than he intended. "What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, and the name sounded even more beautiful coming from her lips. They stood there, standing in the dimly lit corridor, the tension growing between them like a storm about to break. Alexander knew he should return to the party, that he should forget this insane and dangerous attraction. Emma was too young, too innocent, and came from a world completely different from his. But when she looked at him again, when her lips parted in an almost inaudible sigh, Alexander knew it was too late to retreat. The silence in the corridor was deafening. Emma felt her heart racing in her chest as Alexander approached slowly, like a predator who knew exactly the effect he had on his prey. She should run, should go back to her mother, should remember her place in this world that wasn't hers. But her feet seemed glued to the cold marble floor. "You should be out there," whispered Emma, trying to sound firm, but her voice trembled slightly. "With your guests." Alexander stopped just inches from her, so close that Emma could feel the heat emanating from his body, the expensive masculine perfume that enveloped him like an aura of power and danger. He was tall, imposing, and even in his proximity, she felt small and vulnerable. "Perhaps," murmured Alexander, his dark eyes traveling over her face with an intensity that made her burn inside. "But I'm exactly where I want to be." Emma swallowed hard. She knew who he was, knew the stories that circulated about Alexander Blackwood. A ruthless businessman, capable of destroying careers and lives with a simple phone call. Rich beyond imagination, powerful beyond comprehension. And there he was, looking at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. "I need to get back to work," she said, trying to pass by him. But Alexander extended his arm, gently blocking her path without touching her. "How old are you, Emma?" he asked, his deep voice carrying something she couldn't quite identify. 17, she answered, raising her chin in a gesture of defiance that surprised them both. "Why?" Alexander smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was something dark, almost painful. 17, he repeated, as if savoring the word. "Do you know who I am?" "I do." Emma found the courage to look at him directly. "You're Alexander Blackwood, the owner of all this, the man everyone fears. And yet you're not afraid." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, and Emma realized he was right. She should be terrified, should be trembling before the most powerful man she'd ever met. But what she felt was something completely different. A mixture of fascination and desire that scared her more than any fear. "Maybe I should be," she murmured. Alexander took a step closer, and now Emma could see the details of his dark eyes, the small scars that marked his face, signs of a life she could only imagine. There was something wounded in him, something he tried to hide behind the mask of power and control. "You're different," he said almost to himself, "not like the others." "What others?" asked Emma, although part of her already knew the answer. "Those who come to me interested in what I can offer. Money, status, protection. You don't even know me." Emma felt a wave of courage course through her body. "And you? Do you know me?" The question caught him off guard. Alexander Blackwood, a man accustomed to having all the answers, to controlling all situations, was silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal. "No," he finally admitted, "but I want to." Before Emma could respond, the sound of approaching voices made them move away quickly. It was Sarah, looking for her daughter, concerned about her prolonged absence. Emma quickly composed herself, smoothing her clothes and trying to appear natural. "Emma, where were you, dear?" asked Sarah, appearing at the entrance to the corridor with a worried expression. "I was organizing the utensils in the kitchen," lied Emma, avoiding looking at Alexander, who had positioned himself strategically on the other side of the corridor. Sarah seemed to accept the explanation, but Emma noticed the suspicious look her mother cast in Alexander's direction before pulling her by the arm. "Come, we still have a lot of work," said Sarah, leading Emma back to the party area. The rest of the night passed like a blur for Emma. She tried to focus on work, serve the guests, help her mother, but her eyes constantly searched for Alexander. And whenever she found him, she discovered that he was also watching her. It was a dangerous game of furtive glances and unresolved tension that left Emma increasingly restless. When the party finally ended and the last guests departed, Emma helped her mother with the final cleanup. It was almost 3 in the morning when Sarah, exhausted, decided to return home, leaving Emma to finish some details in the main kitchen. "Don't be too long, dear," said Sarah, kissing her daughter's forehead. "And be careful on your way home." Emma nodded, assuring that she wouldn't be long, but when she found herself alone in the silent mansion, with only a few security staff in the external areas, she felt the weight of the loneliness and confusion that had tormented her since the encounter with Alexander. That's when he appeared in the kitchen, still wearing his impeccable black suit, but with the tie loosened and the first buttons of his shirt open. He seemed more human like this, less unreachable, and Emma felt her resistance diminish even more. "I thought you had left," she said, without stopping drying the dishes. "I couldn't," replied Alexander, approaching slowly. "Not without talking to you." Emma put the plate on the counter and turned to face him. "About what?" "About this," he said, gesturing between them. "About what's happening here." "Nothing is happening," lied Emma, but her voice betrayed her. Alexander smiled sadly. "You're a terrible liar, Emma." He was right, and they both knew it. The tension that had grown between them throughout the night had reached an unsustainable point. Emma knew she was walking toward the precipice, but she couldn't stop. "Are you married?" she asked suddenly. "No," answered Alexander. "Never have been." "Why?" "Because I've never found someone who made me want to be better than I am," he said, and there was a brutal honesty in his words that made Emma's heart race. "And now?" she whispered. Alexander moved closer, extending his hand to gently touch her face. Emma closed her eyes at the contact, melting under the touch that was both gentle and possessive. "Now," he murmured, "I don't know who I am anymore." When Emma opened her eyes, she saw a vulnerability in Alexander's gaze that she never imagined could exist, and it was at that moment that she knew she had already lost the battle against her own feelings. Alexander's touch on her face burned like fire, and Emma knew she had reached the point of no return. She should push his hand away, should run, should remember all the reasons why this was impossible. But when he caressed her face with his thumb, a wave of heat traveled through her entire body, leaving her trembling and defenseless. "This is madness," whispered Emma, but she didn't move away. "It is," agreed Alexander, moving closer until she could feel his breath against her skin. Complete madness. His scent enveloped her, an expensive masculine mixture that made her head spin. Emma had never been so close to a man like this, had never felt this overwhelming intensity that seemed to consume her from within. She had dated a boy from school the previous year, innocent kisses and timid touches that didn't remotely compare to the fire that Alexander ignited with just a look. "You shouldn't be here with me," she murmured, trying one last time to be sensible. "Probably not," said Alexander, but his hand descended to her neck, his fingers tracing a delicate line that made Emma close her eyes with a sigh. "But I can't stay away." It was true. All night Alexander had fought against that irrational attraction. He had tried to convince himself that it was just a passing whim, that Emma was too young, too inexperienced, too different from his world. But now, seeing her before him, eyes shining with a mixture of desire and fear, he knew he was lost. "Emma," he said, his husky voice full of warning, "if you leave now, I won't follow you." It was her last chance to escape, and they both knew it. Emma looked into his eyes, seeing the internal struggle he was waging, the desperate attempt to give her an exit before it was too late. But instead of running, she took a step toward him. "And what if I don't want to leave?" she asked, her voice almost a sigh. The question hit Alexander like lightning. For a moment he stood motionless, processing her words, trying to understand, if he'd heard correctly. When he comprehended that yes, that Emma was deliberately choosing to stay, something inside him broke definitively. "Then God help us," he murmured before pulling her to him. The kiss was devastating. There was nothing gentle or delicate about it. It was pure need, years of rigid control falling apart in seconds. Emma moaned against his lips, her hands clutching his dress shirt as if he were the only solid thing in her crumbling world. She had never imagined that a kiss could be like this, wild, desperate, almost violent in its intensity. Alexander pressed her against the kitchen counter, his body covering hers while his hands traveled over her back, her neck, her arms. Emma felt herself melting under his caresses, a desperate need growing, inside her like a storm. "Are you sure?" asked Alexander against her lips, giving her one last chance to retreat. "I am," lied Emma, because in truth she wasn't sure of anything, only knew that she would die if he stopped touching her. Alexander lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist. He climbed the stairs toward the private quarters, each step a confirmation that there was no turning back. Emma buried her face in his neck, inhaling his scent, feeling her heart beating uncontrollably. Alexander's room was immense, decorated with dark mahogany furniture and expensive fabrics. But Emma could barely process the details of the environment. All her attention concentrated on the man who carried her with such ease, on the heat of his body against hers. When Alexander set her down next to the bed, Emma trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation and nervousness. He noticed her hesitation and held her face between his hands, forcing her to look at him. "If you want to stop at any time," he said, "just say so." Emma nodded, unable to speak. Alexander began to kiss her again, more slowly this time, his hands exploring her body with a reverence that surprised her. He was gentle, but there was a hunger in him that she could feel barely contained, as if he were holding back so as not to frighten her. When the clothes began to disappear, Emma felt a mixture of shame and excitement. She had never been naked before a man, never felt so vulnerable and at the same time so powerful. Alexander looked at her as if she were something precious and dangerous at the same time. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice full of sincere admiration. What happened next was a mixture of tenderness and desperation. Alexander was careful with her, aware of her inexperience, but there was an intensity in every touch, every kiss, every moan that left them breathless and lost in each other. Emma surrendered completely, allowing him to guide her through sensations she didn't know existed. It was painful at first, but Alexander whispered words of comfort in her ear, kissed her tears, waited for her to get accustomed before continuing. And when they finally moved together, Emma understood why this was called making love. It was as if their souls were merging, as if she were becoming part of him and he part of her. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Emma felt as if she had been completely transformed. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded with meaning, with things that neither knew how to express in words. Alexander caressed her hair, and Emma could feel the tension gradually returning to his body as the reality of what they had done began to set in. She knew he was regretting it. That rationality was returning to remind him of all the reasons why this had been a mistake. "Alexander," she whispered, but he placed a finger over her lips. "No," he said, his voice carrying a pain she didn't completely understand. "Not now." Emma felt her heart break a little but remained silent. She knew that Dawn would bring consequences that neither was prepared to face. For now she just wanted to lose herself in the sensation of being in his arms, even knowing it might be the only time. When she finally fell asleep, it was with the sound of Alexander's breathing in her ears and the certainty that her life had changed forever. Emma woke up with the first rays of sun invading the room through the silk curtains. For a moment disoriented, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories of the previous night returned like an avalanche. The heat of Alexander's body against hers, the whispers in the dark, the sensation of completeness she had never imagined possible. She extended her hand to the side of the bed where he should be, but found only cold, empty sheets. Alexander had disappeared. Emma sat up in bed, pulling the sheet to cover her naked body, her heart racing for completely different reasons now. She looked around the luxurious room, searching for some sign that he was still in the house, but the silence was absolute. Her clothes were carefully folded on an armchair, a gesture that somehow made his absence even more painful. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she buttoned her blouse. She descended the stairs with hesitant steps, hoping to find him. In the kitchen, in the office, anywhere. But the mansion was empty, only the early morning cleaning staff circulating discreetly through the rooms. "Good morning, miss," a kindly older housekeeper greeted her. "Mr. Blackwood left early. He left this for you." She extended a cream-colored envelope with the Blackwood family crest embossed in relief. Emma took it with trembling hands, recognizing Alexander's masculine and firm handwriting. Inside, only a few lines that hit her like stabs. "Emma, what happened between us was a mistake that cannot be repeated. You deserve someone better. Someone from your world. Forget this night, forget me, Abby." The words danced before her eyes as the tears began to fall. Mistake. He had called the most important night of her life a mistake. Emma felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet, swallowing all the dreams she didn't even know she had, built in just a few hours. She returned home staggering, inventing some excuse for Sarah about having finished the cleaning very late and slept in one of the guest rooms. Her mother, too tired to question, simply nodded and prepared for another day of work. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Emma tried to resume her routine, studies for college entrance exams, her part-time job at a local diner, conversations with friends, but it was as if a part of her had remained on that island, in that room, in the arms of a man who had discarded her as if she meant nothing. News about Alexander reached her through newspapers and television. He had traveled abroad, closing important business deals, always accompanied by stunning models at social events. Seeing photos of him smiling alongside other women was like receiving a stab in the chest, but Emma couldn't stop looking for them, as if it were a self-destructive addiction. Weeks passed. Emma tried dating other boys, going out with friends, doing anything to forget that night that had changed everything, but nothing worked. Alexander Blackwood had left a permanent mark on her soul, a wound that wouldn't heal. It was in the 8th week after that fateful night that Emma realized something was wrong. Her period, always regular, hadn't come. At first, she tried to attribute it to stress, to the emotional tension she had been facing. But when the 2nd week of delay was completed, a terrible possibility began to form in her mind. She bought a pregnancy test at a downtown pharmacy where nobody knew her, her hands sweating as she handed the money to the attendant. At home, she locked herself in the bathroom with her heart pounding in her chest, following the instructions with trembling fingers. 3 minutes. The 3 longest minutes of her life. When she saw the 2 pink lines on the test display, Emma had to lean on the sink to avoid fainting. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Alexander Blackwood's child. The irony of the situation hit her with brutal force. The man who had discarded her as a mistake had left in her the permanent proof of that night. A child grew in her womb, the fruit of an unrequited love, of a passion that should have remained only as a memory. Emma slid down the bathroom wall until she sat on the cold floor, hugging her knees while the tears fell uncontrollably. How would she tell her mother? How would she explain to Sarah that her daughter had gotten involved with the most powerful and dangerous man they knew? How would she raise a child alone, without resources, without support? And Alexander, Should she tell him? The memory of the cruel letter echoed in her mind. He had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with her, that he considered that night a mistake. How would he react to knowing there were permanent consequences for his mistake? For days, Emma lived in a state of denial and panic. She woke up hoping it was all just a nightmare, but the morning sickness that began to appear cruelly reminded her of reality. She hid the symptoms from her mother, inventing excuses for her frequent trips to the bathroom, for her lack of appetite, for the constant fatigue. Part of her wanted to run to Alexander, tell him everything, beg for help. But the other part, wounded and proud, refused to give him another opportunity to reject her. He had been clear about not wanting anything to do with her. Why would it be different now? It was on a rainy afternoon, alone in her small room, that Emma made a decision that would change everything. She took paper and pen and began to write a letter, not to beg or accuse, but simply to inform. He had the right to know, even if he chose to ignore it. "Alexander," she wrote with trembling hands, "you have a son." She couldn't write anything else. She couldn't explain about the fear, the loneliness, the way she still dreamed of him every night. Just those 4 words that carried the weight of 2 lives forever transformed. She posted the letter without a return address, without a signature, just with that devastating revelation. And then, Emma did the only thing she knew how to do. She began to plan how she would survive alone the greatest challenge of her life. 9 months. She had 9 months to figure out how she would become a single mother to a child whose father was a man who had forgotten her before dawn had even broken. Alexander was in his office in the heart of New York when Marcus brought the afternoon correspondence. It was the usual pile of contracts, reports, and social invitations that he mechanically reviewed while his mind navigated the quarterly figures. The last 9 months had been of exponential growth for his businesses, but also of a growing emptiness that he refused to analyze. "Mr. Blackwood," said Marcus hesitantly, placing a simple letter on the desk. "This came without a return. Address, I thought you should see it personally." Alexander frowned. Correspondence without a sender was usually discarded for security reasons, but something in Marcus's expression made him pick up the envelope. It was cheap, common, completely different from the expensive and formal stationery he was accustomed to receiving. He tore it open unceremoniously, expecting to find some attempt at extortion or threat, occupational hazards of his position. But when his eyes traveled over the 4 words written in a feminine and trembling handwriting, the world stopped. "You have a son." Alexander read the phrase once, twice, 3 times, the paper trembling in his hands. There was no signature, no explanations, just that brutal declaration that hit him like a shot to the chest. His mind immediately ran to all the women he had been with in recent years, but none made sense. He had always been careful, always. Emma. The name arose in his mind like lightning, accompanied by a flood of memories that he had spent 9 months trying to suppress. Those brown eyes that haunted him, the sensation of her in his arms, the way he had fled the following morning like a coward. "Marcus," he said, his voice coming out hoarse, "cancel all my appointments." "Sir?" Marcus looked confused. "All of them," repeated Alexander, already getting up and taking his car keys. "I'm traveling." The trip to the coastal town where Emma lived never seemed so long. Alexander drove like a man possessed on the highways, the letter folded in his shirt pocket, like a constant accusation. 1,000 thoughts raced through his head, anger, fear, guilt, and something he refused to name, but that grew with each mile traveled. Why hadn't she told him before? Why wait 9 months? And why, above all, did the idea of Emma carrying his child make his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with anger? He arrived in the small town at dusk, the first lights coming on in the simple houses scattered along the hillside. Finding Emma wasn't difficult. Everyone knew Sarah Miller and her daughter in that small community. But when he reached the indicated address, a modest house painted faded yellow, Alexander hesitated before knocking on the door. What would he say? How would he face Emma after having fled like a coward? How would he deal with the possibility of being a father? It was Emma who opened the door, and the impact of seeing her again was devastating. She was different, not only because of the rounded belly that confirmed his suspicions, but there was a maturity in her eyes that didn't exist 9 months ago. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, and her hair was tied in a loose bun, with a few strands framing her face. "Alexander," she said, showing no surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment. "Emma," he responded, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. His eyes involuntarily descended to her belly, and reality hit him with full force. There was his son, his child. "Come in," she said, moving away from the door. "My mother is working." Alexander followed her into the small but impeccably clean house. It was a completely different world from his. Simple furniture, walls with family photographs, plants in clay pots. But there was something welcoming there that his mansions never possessed. Emma sat heavily in an armchair, a hand moving instinctively to her belly. Alexander remained standing, not knowing how to begin that impossible conversation. "I received your letter," he said finally. "I figured as much," responded Emma, her voice calm but distant. "That's why you're here. Why didn't you tell me before?" Emma looked at him with those eyes that had haunted him for months. "You made it very clear that I was a mistake you wanted to forget. Why would I tell you?" The question hit him like a punch. Alexander remembered the letter he had left for her, the cruel words he had written in a desperate attempt to protect them both. Now he realized how it had sounded, how he had hurt a girl who didn't deserve to be treated that way. "Emma." He began, but she raised her hand to interrupt him. "No," she said with a firmness that surprised him. "Don't come here pretending you care. I sent the letter because you had a right to know, but I don't need you." "You don't need me?" Alexander felt an irrational anger grow inside him. "It's my son, Emma." "Is it?" She stood up, confronting him with a courage that left him speechless. "Because from what I remember, you didn't even wait for dawn to flee. From what I remember, I was a mistake you wanted to forget." Alexander closed his eyes, guilt crushing him. "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" Emma laughed bitterly. "From you? You succeeded. You protected me very well." "You're too young, Emma. You deserve someone better." "Someone better?" She took a step toward him, her eyes shining with contained tears. "You have no right to decide what I deserve. Not after having fled like a coward." The word coward hit him because it was true. Alexander had spent his entire life building an empire, confronting enemies, making impossible decisions. But when it came to Emma, when it came to real feelings, he had fled. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low. "I was a coward, but I'm here now." 9 months later, Emma placed both hands on her belly, her eyes filling with tears. "Do you know what it was like? To discover I was pregnant alone? To face the judgmental looks of this town alone? To go through medical consultations alone?" Each word was a stab in Alexander's conscience. He had imagined Emma moving on with her life, forgetting him, finding someone suitable. He had never imagined that she might have carried his child in solitude and judgment. "Let me help now," he said, taking a step toward her. "No." Emma moved away, the tears finally falling. "You don't understand. I'm not that naive girl who fell in love with you in one night anymore. This pregnancy transformed me. It forced me to grow up, to be strong, to learn that I can't depend on anyone but myself." Alexander felt as if she were slipping through his fingers again, but this time he couldn't simply flee. Not with his son growing inside her. "Emma, please," he begged, something he had never done in his life. "At least give me a chance to know my son." She looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw the internal struggle in her eyes. Finally, she sighed and placed her hand on her belly again. "He kicks when he's agitated," she said softly. "Like now." Alexander looked at where her hand rested and felt something break inside him. His son was there, reacting to the tension in his mother's voice, and he knew nothing about that child he had helped create. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand hesitantly. Emma hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Alexander approached slowly and placed his hand on her belly, immediately feeling a strong movement against his palm. The impact was overwhelming. This was real. His son was there, alive, moving, and at that moment Alexander knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Alexander stood there with his hand on Emma's belly, feeling the child's movements, and for a moment time stopped. It was as if all the power, all the wealth, all the years of building an empire meant nothing compared to that sensation. His son was there, real and alive, and Alexander felt an emotion so intense it almost knocked him down. "It's amazing," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the spot where his hand rested. Emma observed his expression, seeing something she never imagined existed in the man she had known as hard and controlled. There was a vulnerability in that moment that disarmed her, even with all the anger and hurt she carried. "Sometimes he stays awake all night," she said softly. "As if he already knew he'll inherit your insomnia." Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that completely transformed his face. "You know it's a boy?" "I found out at the last consultation." Emma gently moved away, making him withdraw his hand. "Do you? Do you want to know the name I chose?" Alexander nodded, unable to speak. "Jacob," she said. "Jacob Miller." Miller, not Blackwood. Alexander felt the sting of reality returning. Of course she wouldn't give his surname to the child. Why would she? He had abandoned them both before even knowing of the child's existence. "It's a beautiful name," he said finally. "My mother wanted me to give him his father's name." Emma looked at him directly. "But I said his father didn't exist." The words were like stabs, but Alexander knew he deserved them. He had abandoned a pregnant Emma, had let her face everything alone. Now he needed to find a way to recover what he had lost through his own cowardice. "Emma, I know I have no right to ask anything," he began, "but I want to be part of Jacob's life. I want to take care of both of you." "Take care?" Emma laughed without humor. "How, you're going to stay here in this small town? You're going to give up your empire to play happy family?" The question caught him off guard, because she was right. Alexander hadn't thought about the practical details, only about the desperate need to be present in the life of the son who was about to be born. "I can take you both to New York," he suggested. "Give Jacob everything he needs." "Everything he needs?" Emma stood up, walking to the small window that faced the street. "And you think that's money?" "It's a start." "No, Alexander." She turned to face him, and there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "What Jacob needs is a present father, not a distant provider who appears when it's convenient." Alexander approached her, choosing his words carefully. "Then let me be present, let me learn." "You don't even know how this works," Emma shook her head. "You have no idea what it's like to share life with someone, to put another person's needs before your own." "Then teach me," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised her. Emma studied him in silence for a long moment. There was something different about him, something that wasn't present that night on the island. Her humility she never imagined existed in the most powerful man she knew. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why not 9 months ago?" Alexander closed his eyes, knowing he had to be completely honest if he wanted any chance. "Because 9 months. Zago, I was afraid. Afraid to feel, afraid to get attached, afraid to be responsible for someone besides myself. And now you're not anymore." "Now I'm terrified," he admitted with a sad smile, "but I discovered that the fear of losing you both is greater than any other fear." Emma felt something move inside her chest, something she had tried to kill. During all those months of solitude, she couldn't allow herself hope again, not after all the suffering. "Alexander, she began, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. "Emma, I came home early because—" Sarah Miller stopped at the entrance to the living room, her eyes widening when she saw Alexander there. "Mr. Blackwood." The silence that followed was awkward. Sarah looked from Alexander to Emma, noting the tension in the air, and slowly understanding began to form on her face. "Mom," said Emma, her voice tense, He's Jacob's father." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if processing information she already suspected but didn't want to confirm. When she opened them again, there was a mixture of pain and anger in her gaze. "Get out of my house," she said to Alexander, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "Mom," Emma tried, but her mother raised her hand. "No, Emma. This man abandoned my pregnant daughter. Left you to go through all this alone while he enjoyed his life as a rich and powerful man." Alexander knew he deserved every word, but he also knew he couldn't give up. "You're right, Sarah. I was a coward, but I'm here now, wanting to assume my responsibilities." "Responsibilities?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You think you can simply appear here after 9 months and fix everything? Did you see your daughter vomiting every morning? Did you see her crying when neighbors whispered behind her back? Did you see her working extra to save money for the baby's layette?" Each question was a stab in Alexander's conscience. He hadn't seen any of this, hadn't been present for anything Emma had faced. "No," he admitted, "but I want to make up for that." "With money?" Sarah crossed her arms. "You think you can buy our forgiveness?" "Mom, please," intervened Emma, realizing the situation was getting out of control. "It's not about money," said Alexander, looking directly at Sarah. "It's about me wanting to know my son. It's about me having realized that I made the biggest mistake of my life when I abandoned Emma." Sarah studied him for a moment, then turned to her daughter. "Emma, are you sure you want this? Want to open your heart again to a man who's already hurt you once?" Emma looked from her mother to Alexander, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. Jacob chose that moment to move again, reminding her that any choice she made would affect not just her but the son who was about to be born. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just know that Jacob has the right to know his father." "And you?" asked Sarah gently. "What do you want?" Emma looked at Alexander, seeing in him the man who had changed her life forever, the man who had broken her heart, and now returned, asking for a second chance. There were so many unanswered questions, so many fears, so many possibilities of being hurt again. "I want to believe that people can change," she said finally. Alexander felt a wave of relief and gratitude so intense it almost knocked him down. It was a small, fragile chance, but it was a chance. "Thank you," he murmured. "Don't thank me yet," Emma warned him. "This doesn't mean I'm forgiving you. It means only that I'm willing to see if you've really changed." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. He ignored it, but the device insisted with consecutive calls. Finally, frustrated, he answered. "What is it, Marcus?" The assistant's voice was tense. "Mr. Blackwood, you need to return immediately. Richard Valentine is spreading rumors about an illegitimate daughter. The press is starting to ask questions." Alexander felt his blood freeze in his veins. Richard Valentine was his biggest business rival, a man without scruples who had sworn to destroy him. Somehow he had discovered about Emma and Jacob. "I understand," said Alexander, hanging up the phone with trembling hands. "What was it?" asked Emma, noticing the change in his expression. Alexander looked at her and Sarah, knowing that he had just put them both in danger simply by being there. His world had found their world, and this never ended well for ordinary people. "We have a problem," he said, his voice loaded with a concern that made Emma's heart accelerate with fear. The tension in the air was palpable when Alexander hung up the phone. Emma saw the instantaneous transformation in his face, from vulnerable to dangerous in a matter of seconds. It was like watching a mask being put on, the powerful and implacable man retaking control. "What kind of problem?" Emma insisted, one hand unconsciously protecting her belly. Alexander ran his hands through his hair, thinking quickly. Richard Valentine wasn't just a business rival. He was a man without scruples who would use any information to destroy his enemies. If he had discovered about Emma and Jacob, he wouldn't rest until he used this against Alexander in the most cruel way possible. "There's a man," Alexander began carefully, "who has personal reasons to hate me. If he's discovered about you both, he'll try to use you against me." "Use us how?" asked Sarah, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "To blackmail me, to expose our situation. Publicly, to cause scandal." Alexander turned to Emma. You and Jacob could be in danger from the simple fact of being important to me." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of danger? Before Alexander could respond, the house phone rang. Sarah answered, and Emma saw her mother's face progressively pale as the conversation unfolded. "That was Mrs. Roberts, from the bakery," said Sarah, hanging up with trembling hands. "She said 2 men were there asking about you, Emma. They wanted to know where you live, if it's true you're pregnant, who the father is." Alexander cursed softly. "It's already begun." "What's already begun?" Emma stood up, her voice rising a tone. "Alexander, speak clearly. What danger are we in?" Alexander faced her, knowing he could no longer hide the truth. "Richard Valentine is capable of anything to destroy me. He might try to hurt you both to get to me. He might expose our story in the most scandalous way possible. He might what?" Emma took a step toward him, her eyes shining with anger. "Destroy our reputation. Shame my mother in the community where she's worked her entire life. Make my son grow up under the weight of a scandal." "Emma." Alexander tried, but she wasn't finished. "You come here talking about taking responsibility, about being part of Jacob's life, but you brought your enemies with you." The tears began to fall. "I knew this would happen. I knew your world would end up destroying ours." Alexander felt as if he were being torn apart. Seeing Emma crying, knowing he was responsible for putting her in danger, was worse than any physical threat he had ever faced. "I can protect you," he said desperately. "I can take you away from here, to a safe place." "And then what?" asked Sarah, her voice full of bitterness. "We live in hiding forever. Emma abandons all the life she built here. Jacob grows up running from shadows." Alexander had no answer for this. Every solution he thought of seemed inadequate, temporary, unfair to Emma and her family. The phone rang again. This time it was Emma's cell phone. She answered hesitantly, not recognizing the number. "Emma Miller," said an unfamiliar male voice. "Who wants to know?" "I'm a journalist from City Focus Portal. I'd like to talk about your relationship with Alexander Blackwood. Is it true you're expecting his child?" Emma immediately hung up, her hands trembling. She looked at Alexander with an expression of panic that broke his heart. "They already know," she whispered. Alexander took his own phone and dialed quickly. "Marcus, I need a security team here immediately, and I want Richard Valentine investigated. Find out how he got this information." While he spoke, Emma sat down heavily, the reality of the situation finally setting in. In a few hours, her peaceful and private life had transformed into a public nightmare. She thought about Jacob moving in her womb and felt a wave of fierce protection. "I need to leave town," she said suddenly. "What?" Alexander turned to her. "At least until Jacob is born. I can't stay here with journalists chasing me, with the entire town talking about me." Emma stood up, making a decision quickly. "I have an aunt in Vermont. I can stay with her for a few months." "No," said Alexander immediately. "I won't let you run away alone. If you go, I'm going with you." Emma laughed bitterly. "You? You're going to abandon your business to hide in a small town?" "If it's necessary to protect you and Jacob, yes." Sarah observed the exchange between the two, seeing something that Emma perhaps couldn't see yet. There was a sincerity in Alexander's voice that couldn't be faked, a real desperation at the idea of losing them again. "Maybe," said Sarah slowly, "you two need to stop making decisions alone and start working together." Emma and Alexander looked at her in surprise. "Emma, you're carrying his child. Like it or not, you're connected forever." Sarah addressed her daughter. "And Alexander, if you really want to be a father, you need to learn that being family means facing problems together, not running away when things get difficult." Before either could respond, the sound of cars stopping outside made them freeze. Alexander went to the window and saw 2 black SUVs parked on the narrow street. Men in suits were getting out of the vehicles. "They're my security guards," he said quickly, seeing the panic on Emma's face. But when a third car arrived, this one with the markings of a television channel, Alexander knew it was already too late. The story had completely leaked. "They're going to surround the house," he said, his mind working rapidly. "Emma, do you trust me?" She looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same determination she had felt that night on the island, but now directed toward protecting her instead of running from her. "Why?" "Because I'm going to get you out of here now before this turns into a complete circus. But I need you to trust me." Emma looked out the window and saw a reporter preparing to record a story in front of her house. She thought about Jacob, about the life she wanted to build for him, about the consequences of staying or fleeing. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "it's not because I'm forgiving you. It's because my son needs to be born in peace." "I understand," said Alexander, already calling Marcus again. "I'll arrange a discreet exit through the back." "And then?" asked Emma. "What happens then?" Alexander stopped dialing and looked at her directly. "Then I do what I should have done 9 months ago. I fight for you, for us, for our family." It was a promise loaded with meaning, and Emma felt her heart accelerate despite all her efforts to protect herself. Maybe Alexander really had changed. Maybe this crisis was exactly what they needed to discover if there was something real between them, beyond physical attraction. But first, they needed to get out of there before the situation became uncontrollable. And as the shouts of reporters outside grew louder, Emma knew there was no more time for doubts. It was time to trust the man who had broken her heart, because he was the only person who could protect the child she carried. The escape operation happened like a military choreography. In 15 minutes, Alexander had coordinated with his security guards an exit through the back of the house, while Emma quickly packed essentials in a small suitcase. Sarah insisted on going along, refusing to leave her daughter alone in such a dangerous situation. "The car is waiting on the back street," Marcus informed by phone. "The press is concentrated in front. We have a small window." Emma, with trembling hands, took some important documents and the few ultrasounds of Jacob that she kept as treasures. Alexander observed her every movement, noticing how her hands moved protectively over her belly at each louder sound coming from the street. "Ready?" he asked gently. Emma nodded, but when they reached the back door, she hesitated. She was about to leave behind everything she knew, her home, her town, her simple life, to take refuge with a man she barely knew, fleeing from a danger she didn't completely understand. "Hey," Alexander gently touched her arm, "I promise I'll protect you both." "And who will protect me from you?" asked Emma, the vulnerability clear in her voice. The question hit him like a punch. Alexander realized that, for Emma, he represented both salvation and threat. It was he who could protect her from Richard Valentine, but it was also he who had brought this danger into her life. "I will," said Sarah suddenly, appearing beside them with a small suitcase. "I'll protect my daughter from anyone who tries to hurt her, including you." Alexander nodded respectfully. "I understand, and I accept that." The run to the car was tense. Emma, in late pregnancy, moved with difficulty, and with each step Alexander feared the reporters would discover them. When they finally entered the bulletproof SUV, Emma was breathless and visibly shaken. "Where are we going?" asked Sarah, settling in beside her daughter. "I have a house in upstate New York," said Alexander, "isolated, secure, nobody knows of its existence." During the journey, Emma remained silent, looking out the window as the landscape changed from urban to rural. Alexander watched her in the rearview mirror, noticing how she caressed her belly whenever Jacob moved, as if she were silently conversing with her son. It was Sarah who broke the silence. "Alexander, I need to ask you a question." "Of course. Do you know of any documents about your family's past? Certificates, family tree, things like that?" Alexander frowned, finding the question strange in the current context. "Why?" Sarah exchanged a nervous look with Emma, who turned to face her in surprise. "Mom, what's going on?" Sarah hesitated, clearly struggling with something. "I should have told you this before, but I never imagined that you two would meet." Emma felt a chill down her spine. "Tell me what?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Emma, there's something about your father that you don't know. Something I've hidden from you your whole life." My father abandoned me when you were pregnant, said Emma, repeating the story she had always heard. He never wanted to know about me. No, Sarah shook her head, tears beginning to fall. Your father never knew you existed. I never told him. Alexander slowed down, sensing that something important was being revealed. Why? Asked Emma, her voice failing. Because he was married. Because he was too powerful. Because I was just an employee he seduced during an event at the company where I worked. Sarah wiped away her tears. And because when I discovered I was pregnant, he had already died in a car accident. Emma was in shock. Throughout her life she had imagined a father who had rejected her, who had chosen not to be part of her life. Discovering that he never knew of her existence changed everything. What was his name? Asked Alexander, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. Sarah looked at him through the rearview mirror, and there was something in her eyes that confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Edward Blackwood, she whispered. The car almost went off the road. Alexander stepped on the brake abruptly, stopping on the shoulder with his heart racing. Edward Blackwood, his father. The man who had rejected him his whole life, who had never publicly acknowledged him, who had treated his mother like a disposable affair. No, murmured Alexander, his hands trembling on the wheel. Emma looked from Alexander to her mother, trying to process the information. You're saying that you might be half-siblings, finished Sarah, her voice loaded with pain and guilt. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma felt the world spinning around her, all the pieces of her, life rearranging in an impossible and terrible configuration. Alexander, the man she had fallen in love with, the father of the child she carried, could be her brother. This can't be happening, whispered Emma, her hands flying to her belly. Jacob, our son. Alexander abruptly exited the car, walking in circles on the roadside, pulling at his hair. Everything made sense now. The impossible attraction he had felt for Emma, the sense of familiarity, the way she had affected him in a manner that no other woman had managed. We need to be sure, he said, returning to the car with a pale face. We need DNA tests, documents, something that proves or denies this. Alexander, Emma called his attention, and when he looked at her, he saw she was crying. What if it's true? What if Jacob— No, Alexander firmly interrupted. We'll discover the truth first. We won't panic because of suppositions. But even saying this, Alexander felt as if the world were crumbling around him. If Emma were really his sister, everything that had happened between them would be an aberration. The child she carried would be the fruit of an impossible relationship. There's more, said Sarah softly. More what? Asked Alexander, fearing the answer. I kept a letter that Edward wrote to me before he died. He mentioned having another son, a boy that his wife didn't know existed, a son he had had with a woman named Isabel. Alexander froze. Isabel was his mother's name. Where is this letter? He asked, his voice hoarse. At home, hidden. I never knew what to do with it. Emma observed the growing desperation on Alexander's face and felt her heart break. Not only because of the terrible possibility that Sarah had revealed, but because she saw that Alexander was falling apart with the discovery. Let's go to your house, said Emma suddenly. What? Alexander looked at her in surprise. Let's get that letter. Let's go to registry offices, do tests, discover the truth. Emma dried her tears and straightened her shoulders. Because I'm not going to spend the rest of my pregnancy living with this doubt. Jacob deserves that we know the truth about him. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of admiration and anguish. Even faced with the most terrible possibility, Emma was being strong, practical, focused on her child's well-being. It could be dangerous to go back, he warned. More dangerous than living with this uncertainty. Emma faced him directly. Alexander, if we're siblings, we need to deal with it. If we're not, we need to deal with that too. But let's deal with it. Together. At that moment, Alexander knew he loved Emma, no matter if she was his sister, his soulmate, or anything else. He loved her strength, her courage, the way she always put Jacob first. and that made everything even more painful. He turned the car around and headed back toward town, knowing they were returning not just to seek answers, but to face a truth that could destroy any chance of happiness they might have together. The return to town was tense and silent. Alexander had hired a security team to sweep Sarah's house before they arrived, ensuring there were no journalists or people from Richard Valentine waiting for them. Emma remained quiet during the entire journey, a hand constantly on her belly, as if she were protecting Jacob from the disturbing truths they might be about to discover. When they arrived at the house, it was already night. Sarah went directly to her room, returning minutes later with an old shoebox. Inside were letters, old photographs and documents she had kept for years. With trembling hands, she searched until she found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, handing a yellowed letter to Alexander. "Edward wrote this to me 2 weeks before he died." Alexander took the letter carefully, as if it were a bomb about to explode. The handwriting was elegant, clearly from someone educated and refined. He began to read aloud. "My dear Sarah, I know our time together was brief, but you brought light to very dark days in my life. I need you to know that I have another son, a boy that my wife believes is mine, but who is actually the son of Isabel, a woman I loved before the arranged marriage. This secret corrodes me, just as it corrodes me not to be able to publicly acknowledge our relationship." Alexander stopped reading, the paper trembling in his hands. "Isabel was my mother," he said, his voice hoarse. "But if he's saying I'm not his son—" Emma approached, taking the letter from his hands and continuing to read. "The boy is named Alexander, and although he carries the Blackwood surname, his real father was a man named Robert Wilson, a literature professor that Isabel met at university. I only discovered this recently, through documents I found in her room after she died. Robert never knew he had a son. Isabel had sought him out at the time, but he had already moved abroad." The silence that followed was absolute. Emma, Alexander, and Sarah stood there, processing the information that changed everything. "You're not Edward's son," whispered Emma, tears beginning to fall. "We're not siblings." Alexander felt as if he could breathe again. The pressure in his chest that had grown during the entire trip disappeared instantly, replaced by a relief so intense it made him dizzy. "Jacob is okay," murmured Emma, embracing her belly. "Our son is okay." Alexander approached her, enveloping her in his arms for the first time since that night on the island. Emma didn't resist, allowing herself to melt against his chest, feeling the security and warmth she had tried to forget during all those months. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her hair. "I'm sorry for everything, for having run away, for having taken so long to return, for having brought all this chaos into your life." "Alexander," Emma moved slightly away to look him in the eyes. "We need to talk, really, about us, about what we want, about how this is going to work." Before he could respond, Alexander's phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice was full of urgency. "Mr. Blackwood, Richard Valentine just gave a press conference. He's alleging that you have a hidden underage daughter, that you abused your position of power. The story is on all channels." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling anger grow inside him. "What a son of a bitch," he muttered. "There's more," continued Marcus. "He's also questioning the legitimacy of several of your businesses. He's calling for a federal investigation." "Alexander?" Emma touched his arm, perceiving the growing tension. "Richard is trying to destroy me," he explained, hanging up the phone. "He's spreading lies, distorting our story." "Then let's tell the truth," said Emma with determination. "What?" "Let's give our version of the facts, together." Emma straightened her shoulders, showing the strength that Alexander had admired from the first day. "I'm not going to hide as if I'd done something wrong, and you're not going to face this alone." Alexander looked at her with admiration and incredulity. "Emma, this will expose you publicly. Your privacy will end." "My privacy ended the moment you stepped into this house today," she said pragmatically. "Now it's a matter of controlling the narrative, or letting others tell our story for us." Sarah, who had observed the exchange in silence, approached the two. "Are you sure about this? Once you go public, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," said Emma, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. "I want Jacob to grow up knowing the truth about how his parents met, not a distorted version created by his father's enemies." Alexander held her hands, studying her face. "Are you sure? This means our life will never be private again. Jacob will grow, up under the spotlight. Then we'll teach our son to deal with it," said Emma. "Together." The word "together" echoed between them, loaded with meaning. Alexander realized that Emma wasn't just talking about facing the current crisis. She was talking about building a future. "Emma," he said, his voice full of emotion, "I love you. Not just as the mother of my son, but as a woman, as the person who made me want to be better than I am." Emma felt her heart race. These were the words she had dreamed of hearing during all those months of solitude, but now they came accompanied by the maturity and certainty that didn't exist that night on the island. "I love you too," she admitted. "Even when I tried to hate you, even when I was furious with you, I never managed to stop loving you." They kissed then, a kiss different from the first they had shared. This one wasn't loaded with desperation and uncontrolled passion, but with genuine love, commitment, and the promise of a future built together. The moment was interrupted by a strong contraction that made Emma double over in pain. "Emma!" Alexander held her, concerned. "It's okay," she said, breathing deeply. "They're just practice contractions. Jacob is anxious to be born." "Maybe we should go to the hospital," suggested Sarah, worried. "Not yet," Emma smiled despite the pain, "but I don't think we have much time. Jacob will be born soon." Alexander looked at her, a mixture of fear and excitement taking hold of him. His son was about to be born in the middle of one of the biggest crises of his life, but for the first time he wasn't facing everything alone. "Then let's give our press conference today," he said decisively. "Before Jacob is born. I want our son to come into the world in a united family, without scandals or lies hanging over us." Emma nodded, feeling another contraction beginning. They had very little time to fix everything that had gone wrong, but for the first time since that night on the island, Emma believed they would succeed. After all, they were facing everything together now. And that made all the difference. The press conference was scheduled for early the next morning. Alexander had mobilized his entire public relations team to organize the event, but it was Emma who dictated the terms. She wanted the truth to be told without embellishment, without attempts to soften or politicize their love story. "We'll tell exactly how it happened," she said to Alexander as they prepared. "The meeting on the island, the night we spent together, your flight, my pregnancy, your return, everything." Alexander watched her get ready with a mixture of admiration and concern. Emma was almost 40 weeks pregnant, but there was an iron determination in her eyes that impressed him. She had chosen a simple navy blue dress that enhanced her pregnancy without hiding it, making it clear that she felt no shame about her condition. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, for the 10th time. "Alexander," she turned to face him, "I carried this baby alone for 9 months. I faced the judgments of this town alone. Now it's time to show that I'm not alone anymore." The press room of the town's main hotel was packed. Journalists from across the country had traveled to cover what promised to be the scandal of the year, involving one of the most powerful men in America. But when Alexander and Emma entered together, hand in hand, the murmuring ceased. Emma sat calmly before the cameras, one hand resting on her prominent belly. Alexander took his place beside her, and for the first time in his adult life he seemed genuinely nervous. "Good morning," Emma began, her voice clear and firm. "My name is Emma Miller. I'm 17 years old, and I'm here to tell the truth about my relationship with Alexander Blackwood." During the next 20 minutes, Emma told her story with a brutal honesty that left the room in absolute silence. She spoke about the immediate attraction she felt for Alexander, about the night they spent together, about the abandonment and the discovery of her pregnancy. Alexander remained by her side, confirming every word, publicly assuming his responsibility and his love for her. "I made many mistakes," said Alexander when it was his turn to speak. "I ran when I should have stayed. I abandoned Emma when she needed me most. But I'm here now, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for those mistakes." It was then that a journalist asked the question everyone was thinking: what about Richard Valentine's allegations about abuse of power? Emma leaned forward, her eyes shining with indignation. "Richard Valentine wasn't there that night. He doesn't know our feelings, our fears, our dreams. What happened between Alexander and me was real, it was consensual, and it resulted in the creation of a new life that we will love forever." The interview ended with Emma feeling a stronger contraction than the previous ones. Alexander helped her stand up, and when she turned to leave, her water broke right there, in front of all the cameras. "Jacob is coming," she whispered, a mixture of pain and excitement in her voice. What followed was chaotic. Alexander carried Emma in his arms to the car, while Marcus coordinated the journey to the nearest hospital. The cameras captured everything: Alexander's protective desperation, Emma's impressive strength, the moment when their love story left the pages of newspapers to become real life. At the hospital, while Emma was in labor, Alexander received an unexpected call. It was Richard Valentine. "You may have won this battle," said Richard, his voice full of hatred, "but the war is far from over." "The war is over, Richard," Alexander responded calmly. "You lost the moment you tried to use a pregnant woman and an innocent child to get to me." "We'll see," said Richard before hanging up. But Alexander was no longer worried about threats. His attention was completely focused on Emma, who was bravely fighting to bring Jacob into the world. He held her hand during each contraction, whispered words of encouragement in her ear, promised that he would never leave her alone again. Jacob Blackwood Miller was born at 3 o'clock on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, weighing 7 pounds and crying with enough strength to fill his parents' hearts with joy. When the doctor placed the baby in Emma's arms, Alexander felt tears running down his face, something that hadn't happened since his mother's death. "He's perfect," whispered Emma, her eyes shining with love as she looked at her son. "Like his mother," said Alexander, gently kissing Emma's forehead. In the weeks that followed, the public reaction was surprisingly positive. Emma's honesty during the press conference, combined with the image of Alexander carrying her in his arms when she went into labor, had touched the country's heart. Richard Valentine tried some final maneuvers to harm Alexander, but his attempts seemed increasingly desperate and petty in the face of the happy family Alexander had formed. 3 months after Jacob's birth, Alexander surprised Emma with a request she had never expected. It wasn't in a luxurious mansion or an expensive restaurant, but in Emma's small room, while she nursed Jacob on a quiet morning. "Marry me," he said simply, offering a simple diamond ring. Emma looked at the ring, then at Alexander, then at Jacob sleeping in her arms. "Why?" she asked. "Because I want to wake up by your side every day. Because I want to teach Jacob to walk, to talk, to be a good man. Because I want to grow old with you and create more children if you want." Alexander knelt beside the bed. "Because I love you more than I've loved anything in life. And your business, your empire, your life of power?" Alexander smiled. "I sold half the companies. The ones that remain are all legitimate, transparent. I want Jacob to be proud of the father he has." Emma felt tears welling up. The man kneeling before her was no longer the powerful and feared billionaire she had met on the island. He was simply Alexander, father, partner, the man who had learned. That love was stronger than any empire. "Yes," she said, extending her hand for him to place the ring. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was simple in a small church in town, with only the people who really mattered present. Sarah cried throughout the ceremony. Jacob slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms, and Emma never felt more beautiful than in that simple white dress, beside the man who had forever transformed her life. When they kissed to seal the union, Emma whispered against Alexander's lips, "Thank you for coming back." "Thank you for waiting for me," he responded. And there, in that small church before God and the people they loved, Alexander and Emma sealed a union that had been born of desire, grown through pain, and finally blossomed into true love. Jacob woke at that moment, as if he knew something important was happening, and his parents laughed through their tears as they took him in their arms together. It was the first official photo of the Blackwood Miller family, and it would be the first of many. Because sometimes the best love stories are those that pass through fire and emerge even stronger. Sometimes it's necessary to lose everything to discover what really matters. And sometimes love doesn't come to save, it comes to transform, to elevate, to create something complete.